Hello and welcome to the Royal Academy of Engineering Education and Skills webinar series. I'm Rhys Morgan, Director of Education and Engineering at the Academy, and I'm your host for today. We had a really interesting presentation last week from Tom Ravenscroft, the Chief Executive and founder of the Skills Builder Partnership, a social enterprise that has developed a new framework for teachers to support the development of workplace skills in young people alongside the curriculum in schools. You can watch the presentation again on the Academy website under the Education section. And of course, you can watch all the other presentations from the series on the site. Just a reminder that today's presentation will also be recorded. So this is the last seminar of our series. It's been really fabulous, and we've had such a diverse range of topics over the last 11 weeks. And I'd like to say a huge thank you to the team behind the scenes, Guy, Sophie, Lucy, Tom and Gideon. I'm just the eye candy for you all. It has meant I've had to keep up ironing though once a week, and so I'm keeping those essential skills going through lockdown. It does make you realize though how hard teachers work to do this 7 or 8 times a day. That is preparation on a scale that I cannot fathom, and I salute you all. Well done. Right, now on to our final session. In 2019, the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Diversity and Inclusion in STEM launched an inquiry on equity in STEM education. The inquiry, led by members of Parliament and the House of Lords and supported by the Secretariat, the British Science Association, aimed to understand whether young people are provided with equitable learning opportunities within STEM education, regardless of their background. The report was launched in June against the backdrop of the COVID-19 pandemic and the Black Lives Matter protests. The final report provides 5 key findings and 6 recommendations for government to make STEM education equitable for all young people in England specifically, but I'm sure they have relevance across the devolved administrations of the UK as well. To present the findings of the report, which was excellent, by the way, it cites the Academy several times, we have Jon Fitzmaurice from the British Science Association, the Secretary of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Diversity in STEM. Jon has over 10 years experience working in the charity sector, working for organisations that promote social justice and educational causes. He is currently Head of Policy, Partnerships and Impact at the British Science Association, where he oversees its research, policy and campaigns work with a specific focus on diversity, civil society and convening leaders to overcome complex issues facing society. Okay, just a quick reminder that we will also be doing a Q&A after Jon's talk. So now enough from me, time to hand over to Jon to present the findings of the APPG on how to make STEM education equitable for all. Jon.
Thank you very much, Rhys, and thank you very much for joining me here today. So as Rhys said, I work at the British Science Association, and one of the hats that I wear is being the Secretariat for the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Diversity and Inclusion in STEM. I've worked previously within STEM enrichment and celebration, but in recent years have been working more on campaigns, policy and research work. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give an introduction to the APPG and then go through how we started the inquiry into equity in STEM education, and then look at findings and recommendations. I'm really looking forward to your questions later on. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So the APPG was formed back in 2018 to give a voice around diversity and inclusion within Parliament. And the BSA has been discussing the issue of underrepresentation, particularly of women in STEM, with Chion Wara MP, who is the MP for Newcastle Central. And we've been talking about the ways to engage the government and parliamentarians in the issue. As some of you may know, Chi is a former electrical engineer who says that Parliament is the most diverse place that she's ever worked. Now that's arguably saying something, and I think she is fed up of discussing the issue around diversity in STEM with no real change happening despite the many efforts of organisations across the STEM sector and in government. She believed that actually not much had changed since she did her degree in the 1980s, and she was often still the only woman, the only black person, and the only working class person, and the only northerner in the room. Her belief was we didn't need any more roundtable discussions. We needed strong policy recommendations that could change systems that create this underrepresentation. And the APPG was set up to be that voice within Parliament. And we have just under 30 members from a wide range of backgrounds. So you can see some of them here. So we've got people like Baroness Benjamin, who's better known as Floella Benjamin, who's a former children's TV presenter, Carol Monaghan, who's a former physics teacher in Scotland, Tanni Gray-Thompson, one of Britain's greatest Paralympic athletes. You've got Baroness Brown of Cambridge, better known as Thane Professor Julia King, who is a celebrated engineer and former Vice-Chancellor of Aston University and Chair of STEM Learning. And then you've got former government ministers like Lord David Willits, the former Universities and Science Minister, and people like Lord Chris Smith. So a whole range of people coming together on this issue who think that we need to make a change. Next slide, please. Supported the people that help us do this work and help me as the Secretariat do this work are our sponsors. And I think we're really pleased to have such a coalition of organisations, including businesses, universities, charities and professional bodies like the Royal Academy of Engineering, who really support this and not only bring their resources, but also bring their expertise in these areas so we can have one central voice about these important issues. Next slide, please. And this here is a picture of one of our meetings in Parliament when we were allowed to meet in person. And you've got a picture there of Norman Lamb, MP or former MP, who was at the time the chair of the Science and Technology Select Committee, and he had previously been a minister during the coalition. And he was speaking about regional disparity. And many of these events were really well attended, but they didn't necessarily bring the new evidence or policy recommendations to the fore. And as an example of this, you've got, he was talking about diversity and saying the Select Committee should do an inquiry around diversity. And later that year, in 2019, they looked at the impact of science funding on equality, diversity and inclusion. But this was discontinued because of the 2019 general election. And then Norman Lamb left Parliament and you had a new committee chair. And so for me, this demonstrates the need for an APPG like ours to continue the messaging around diversity and inclusion in STEM, so that despite who gets elected or who loses their seat, the discussion can continue. Next slide, please. And so this leads us up to going into an inquiry format. And we undertook a call for ideas in early 2019 and received over 70 ideas from parliamentarians and the STEM sector. STEM education has been a key interest for the APPG and its members, and there have been lots of policy ideas that have been very precise, whereas the members of our group felt that we needed a broader theme that allowed the group to understand the key challenges within STEM education through an equality, diversity and inclusion lens. The question of underrepresentation of certain demographics within STEM industries and academia is one that has challenged policymakers, businesses and civil society and campaigners for many, many years. And I'm sure we're all aware of stats such as the shortage of STEM skills in a number of important sectors has been estimated to cost businesses 1.5 billion per year. Yet, I think it's really important also to look at it from a social justice point of view and think about what those young people who maybe miss out on the opportunities are also missing out from not having sort of engagement in STEM. And then going on to the next slide, the reason that we looked at equity rather than equality is that giving young people an equal opportunity isn't enough to provide equality and opportunity. I think we can all see the recent Black Lives movement has really demonstrated that many people that equality isn't enough to change the intended or unintended impact of the institutional systems have on minority groups. And the inquiry aimed to understand whether young people are provided with equitable learning opportunities within STEM education, regardless of their backgrounds. And next slide please, we looked at we did a call for evidence that was sent out in March 2019, and asking organisations and teachers and other people to come forward where they think there's inequity across different protected characteristics within STEM education, where we can learn from other countries or developed nations and look at what policy change could alleviate this inequity. And I think it's important to say this report focuses on STEM education policy in England, and the reason for that is that the Houses of Parliament only have the right to look at English education system because obviously Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland have devolved control over education in their systems, although, as Rhys said, some of this can be applied to other systems as well. And then, who took part? So our next slide, we had 20 responses to the evidence, to the call for evidence. We had over 20 witnesses appeared at parliamentary hearings. We did a desk review of over 80 key pieces of literature, and then the Secretariat undertook 20 interviews with experts before doing a final critical review with about 15 experts. So we really did it as a listening exercise to hear what was going on, where there was evidence, where there were gaps, and how this report could help address that through the mechanism of the APPG. And now I'm going to move on to the findings. And there were 5 findings that the report created. And the first one was there is a need for a more joined up approach by government to tackle causes of inequity in STEM education. And I think importantly, we found at each stage of the education journey that there is inequity. It becomes more pronounced at GCSE and beyond. And I think there has been lots of systemic changes around STEM education, but the impact on inequity has been limited and inadequate. The updating of the GCSEs in England in 2018 addressed some concerns, but did not change the inequity of the main dual route system at GCSE of double and triple science. And that was something that people highlighted time and time again in their evidence. Research has enabled a better understanding of causes and challenges around gender inequity, particularly in engineering and physics. And I'd say that organisations like the Royal Academy of Engineering and the Institute of Physics have done some really great work, and it's really brought new evidence to the fore. But too many studies take a broad longitudinal perspective, and I think the work done by Professor Louise Archer and her team at University College London is really exemplifies that sort of real approach around science capital. There's a need for more studies to take an intersectional view and focus on the real issues faced by young people who often experience multiple barriers. And I think that multiple barriers is something that comes through again and again. And if we move on to finding number 2, this is a really key finding for us. Inequity cannot be seen just through the lenses of gender, economic disadvantage, or ethnicity. It's an oversimplification. And although government and a lot of STEM organisations have looked at inequity through these lenses, by doing so, you do omit others. They are very important, but you do omit others. And I think from an early age, there are lots of societal factors and factors within the wider curriculum, whether it's the design of toys, the attitudes of family and friends and role models. They build unhelpful stereotypes. And I think within the report, we mentioned that research has shown that children's job preferences are already gendered by the age of 7. And that's a real challenge for the STEM sector and STEM education to sort of challenge. And I think importantly, those with special educational needs and disabilities represent some 15% of all pupils on roll in schools. Yet there is very little evidence around the impact that this current STEM education system has on that, and we will ignore those that area if we just look through those three lenses, and knowing that many people that maybe are affected by their gender, their maybe economic disadvantage or ethnicity might also have a disability as well. So it's really important to take an intersectional approach. And on to the next finding, please. I think something that probably won't surprise most people listening to this, and I'd be clear that in the report we have a statement in the executive summary that says young people are not the problem. And I want to be very clear, teachers are not the problem either. I think what we're talking about here is the systems that create inequality. So improving teaching will lead to positive outcomes for young people. Within the STEM sector and wider society, it's important to do more to counter the perceptions of STEM that adversely influence students. Therefore, we need to broaden how we teach, learn and practice STEM. And then government targets for training science teachers have not been reached in recent years, and schools in disadvantaged areas often struggle to recruit and retain experienced STEM qualified teachers. And then many teachers are not equipped to know how to support students to avoid an "it's not for me" mentality and find meaningful connection with STEM. And I'd just be clear that this is not down to a lack of interest on behalf of the teachers or the teaching profession, or a will to tackle those issues, but a lack of time, resource and support for continuing professional development. And I think the Wellcome Trust, among others, have noted that professional development also plays a key role in retaining science teachers. And then on to the next one, please. And wider access to good careers education has the potential to raise aspirations around STEM and reduce inequity. I think there's this disconnect between young people's career aspirations and the jobs that are actually out there. And I think there's a real lack of awareness for many young people of the career options that are enabled by STEM qualifications, partly because some of those STEM jobs might not have even been created yet. And so young people often think there's no point in studying STEM unless they want to become a scientist or a doctor. And that's something that Louise Archer and her team around Aspires found. And also, they found that despite being interested in and highly valuing science, Black students tend to express limited aspirations to careers in science and remain underrepresented in post-16 courses. And that's not a pattern that is solely explained by attainment. And then evidence suggests that effective and impartial careers provision is particularly important in students from working class backgrounds. And I think this is a really key statement, is that the availability of good careers education is patchy, inadequate and provided too late. And it exacerbates inequity, especially where you don't have a scientist or engineer in your family and you don't know sort of how the systems work. And also direct experience of the workplace by young people can play an important role in changing perceptions and raising aspirations around STEM, but more and better opportunities are needed. And then moving on to finding 5. Schools' roles in GCSE option selection is leading to inequity, especially in the most disadvantaged areas. And I think this comes back to a point I made earlier, but the existence of 2 GCSE routes, so double award or known as combined science, and then triple science, also known as chemistry, biology and physics, was retained following extensive updating in 2016. It's intended to provide more choice and enable higher attaining students to study science in greater depth. However, this impacts on equity. There is evidence that students are not being properly informed or involved in decision making on the route that they follow. And then if you look at 50% of highly able young people who have been on free school meals in the last 6 years are taking triple science compared to 69% of those not in that category. And that data has been around for a while. And also that within this, we know that approximately 8% of schools in England, often situated in disadvantaged areas, do not enter any students for triple science. And that fails to deliver government policy and is potentially wasting talent and limiting opportunity and needs to be urgently corrected. And I think because you create this divide of having these two options, double award science is often more likely to receive lower quality teaching than triple science, partly because triple science is likely to be prioritised for those people that might be the future scientists, engineers and technicians of the future. And that often means that the more experienced or specialised staff are allocated those. And then there's a big concern around computer science. It's not offered in 38% of schools in England, and significantly limiting the choice of students in those schools. And I think added with what's going on with COVID-19, you've got a real issue there where we can see that many students don't have computers at home or are sharing devices. Those students are even less likely to go on to a career in computer science if they don't have access to computers. And now I'm going to go on to the recommendations. So we have 6 recommendations. And the first recommendation is there should be a minister responsible for addressing inequity within the education system and widening participation within higher and further education to prepare young people for the future. And the reason we haven't said a minister for inequity within STEM is we think there are so many issues with inequity across schools that STEM plays an important role, but there needs to be a wider view. This idea was come up before COVID-19 and the many impacts, but arguably this is more important than ever. We've recommended that the portfolio sits within the Department for Education, but it's all important to say that there are many departments in government that are interested in policy around STEM skills and spend money on different activities around that. But it's important for the Department for Education to sort of lead coordination. We call for this minister to set up a commission for future STEM skills to set a clear strategy to improve Britain's productivity and enable all citizens to fulfil their potential. And government, it's vital, we think, that government conducts an in-depth review of each stage of the education pathway to identify policies and measures to reduce inequity and loss of opportunity. And then on to recommendation number 2. STEM education really needs to be relevant to the lives of young people and appeal to a wider cross-section of young people. And we need to create the conditions to enable young people to experience STEM as inclusive and for me. We ask that greater weight is given to measuring equity when reviewing STEM education and the barriers for participation in students, particularly in relation to low aspirations. And there's an issue around grading and perceptions of difficulty within STEM subjects. Steps should also be taken to ensure that all teaching and learning approaches and resources are broad and inclusive in the knowledge and practices, and do not produce this normative idea of who does STEM as, you know, a white older man from a middle class background. It's really important that young people see the different types of people that work and use STEM in their daily lives. I think an important thing for us is that it's vital that we improve the capturing and sharing of information on effectiveness of interventions that reduce misperceptions and raise aspirations. And the final sort of sub-recommendation or recommendation 2 is that we recommend that an organisation is chosen for, or a coalition is created that can work with the careers, enterprise companies, STEM Learning and others to provide an easily accessible and user-friendly mechanism by which schools and teachers, parents and students can connect with them. I think in 2016, the Royal Academy of Engineering reported that there are over 600 non-governmental providers of STEM interventions. That's very confusing for young people, parents and teachers. And then recommendation 3, there should be more action to address teacher shortages in STEM subjects and more support for teachers to access specialist skills and knowledge linked to improving equity. I think we need to recognise that the government policy is supportive, but there needs to be more resources to strengthen the recruitment and retention of specialist STEM skills, particularly in disadvantaged areas, with a focus on physical sciences, maths and computing. And we called on the Department of Education to update the initial teacher education and continuing professional development so that all teachers, within STEM or not, are better prepared to tackle inequity in the classroom. And then moving on to recommendation 4. We think it's important that the career strategy for England that was launched in 2017 is fully implemented and followed to ensure that it's consistent across all schools, reaching all young people. And I think government need to ensure that new arrangements are speeded up, any gaps in delivery are urgently identified, and additional support is provided to schools that need it. Again, there's a real point around data here, that the robust evaluation and monitoring and reporting is needed so you can spot where the issues are and act on those. And then going on to the penultimate recommendation around the government should address and take steps to address the existing inequalities in provision of double and triple science at GCSE. And we want them to look at how you support schools that aren't offering triple science at the moment, and how do you support them so that they can do it without delay. We also request the government considers what policy changes and other measures are necessary to ensure that decisions around whether individual students take double or triple science are most appropriate to the individual students as a matter of urgency. And again, another point about monitoring, we asked the government to ensure public reporting includes annual uptake of triple and double award compared to the overall pupil characteristics, which again will allow different interventions to be brought in if there are clear things shown by that data. And then on to the final recommendation, which is separate from 5 but related, is that there should be a fundamental a review of fundamental changes to STEM GCSEs which consider equity issues. We think that that could see a revised common single route of study, and we'd also like to see how you can look at the role that practical work plays in equity and how those young people perceive science, and actually look at the content of practical work, how it's assessed and how it's resourced in all schools. I think that's even more important now, knowing that when schools go back in September, practicals are going to be incredibly limited, and what impacts that's going to have on the students from disadvantaged backgrounds. And then the final area is around we need to reduce the acute divide in computer science. Changes that may help ensure that computer science is offered in all schools need to be looked at, so that we can have a broadened pool of teachers who can deliver it to a good standard so that everyone can access computer science. And then I'm just going to have a final couple of slides to finish. So we launched on the 23rd of June against, I'm sure everyone can imagine, a rather busy news agenda with COVID-19, the Black Lives Matter movement and so on. But we managed to break through and get some really good publicity on this and national coverage. So Chiomwara was interviewed on Sky News with Adam Bolton. You also had coverage in things like Computer Weekly, the Times Educational Supplement, and then down the bottom middle, that's the Daily Express's article, and then also The Guardian covered it. And in recent weeks, we've also seen coverage, Chi being interviewed on BBC 5 Live and others. So it's an issue that seems to be getting through to a wider audience. So how can we influence Parliament? I suppose this is where my request to you is that MPs listen to their constituents more than they listen to people that are interested in policy like me. And if you think this report has some really good elements and needs to be implemented by government, we urge you to write to your MP, tell them about your story and why you think this is really important. The more MPs and Lords we get to become members of the APPG, the more impact we will have. It's important that we continue as organisations to highlight these issues with government, and that we build up that robust evidence of inequity. So over the next few years, we're going to see so many challenges in society. How do we build up that evidence so you can keep monitoring it and make changes? And then I think it's important that STEM educators and STEM organisations continue to collaborate on messaging and speak with as few voices as possible to ensure that the message really gets through, and we make inequity in STEM education a real issue that all MPs and Lords think is important to them and their constituents. And then finally, the very final slide is just to say you can read the full report, all 52 pages in its full glory on the APPG website, and you can also sign up for updates. So I'm open to any questions, so thank you.
Thank you, John. That was really fascinating and really good to hear the summary of the presentation of the findings and the recommendations. And yes, do please, viewers, read the report. Johnny Rich very kindly put a link into the report on the British Science Association website, but you can also find it through the APPG on diversity in STEM. Great coverage that you got with the report launch, and it's, I think, really useful right at the outset to talk about the difference between equality and equity, and it was a great cartoon that illustrated the difference so well. I'm just interested, sorry, there's been lots of comments in the chat box as well, and I do very much hope that people will enter questions into the Q&A box. It's much easier for me to pick them out of the Q&A box than the chat box. But I'm just interested in this kind of notion of inequity in the education system more generally, rather than just focusing on STEM. And I know that the Institute of Physics has very much shifted their emphasis away from looking at issues around physics specifically to issues around bias and inequity in the education system in a school more generally. So did the APPG look at that, how STEM sits within the school?
Yeah, I think what's really important to think about when you're thinking about STEM is that arguably English is as important to access to the science subjects and to the STEM subjects as any other subject. So I think it is really important that you look at inequity across the board. I think the APPG, most of the evidence came through around STEM, but I think if you take a whole school approach around science, that has to be across the board. And a lot of our recommendations, I think, other organisations that are really interested in inequity within education could take on board. So, you know, the updating to teacher training, so that you have unconscious bias training. Do you understand where there is clear sort of patterns of inequity? Because I think the inequity that young people feel in STEM generally, or STEM subjects, isn't generally just applied to those subjects. So the more that we can work with other organisations, the better. But generally, we picked up on the themes within STEM. But again, I'd say that the call for the minister looking at inequity within education was something that we've been talking about with the members for a while. I think it's really hit its time with what's going on currently. And the more that we can get people behind that idea that, you know, there are some real challenges for society, and that the Department for Education maybe needs to take a slightly new approach. If we could get other organisations beyond STEM to be involved in that, I think it would have some real impact for all young people.
Interesting. And I noted that Abby Hope put a message in saying that actually things like the reading ages of exam papers, last year the higher GCSE higher physics paper had a higher reading age than the English literature paper. So these are obviously significant challenges. So it is taking that kind of whole school and whole education subject approach to this matter. It's really important.
And I'd also just add to that I'm married to a history teacher, so I know this, but you learn a lot about, you know, the applications of science through medicine through time, and we can't just see those hours where you actually learn about STEM as where you learn around what impact it has on society. There are so many other areas, and it's really important to work in partnership with those subjects. And I think the schools that do this sort of best and allow people to see different, I suppose, role models are not just using role models within STEM. They're using wider role models and the impacts that a STEM qualification can have on your career.
Are we at risk, though, and I'm playing devil's advocate really here, are we at risk of kind of special pleading for STEM here? So I'm interested in this idea of, so if you look at the absolute number of physics A-level students compared to the proportions, we know that only 20% of the physics A-level cohort are female, but actually when you look at the absolute number, there are more girls doing physics A-level than there are doing French, for example. We never complain about French being disproportionately, or not enough girls doing French, for example. So is there a concern that, the history, the arts and humanities are saying, well, God, we've all got challenges?
Yeah, I think so. I'd say that I'm probably not talking on behalf of the APPG here, but talking sort of from a British Science Association perspective. I'd say that you've got, if you changed the GCSE and you went down to everyone doing double award, there are many arguments for and against that. But if you did, you would create more time within the curriculum for other subjects to come in that really benefit students as well. And I think the English system is strange compared to international comparisons. It specialises incredibly early. And by the time, if you are doing a science and engineering degree, by the time you get to university, you often have more knowledge than a lot of your sort of international companions. And whether that is needed is a whole different question. But I would say that you don't want to just have special pleading for STEM. So I think when in recommendation 6, when we talked about, you need to look at the way that GCSEs, the science GCSEs are done, there could be some really good arguments for going down to double award, and as well as really good arguments for going to triple science as well.
Okay, there's lots and lots of questions coming into the Q&A box. So I am going to turn to them in a very quick second, but I just want to pick up on this double versus triple science issue. It has been a kind of key feature of the findings and the recommendations. I'm reliably advised that double science does prepare students for A-level. Now, you highlighted one particular issue, which is that the priority is given in terms of the teaching quality to the triple science. I'd be keen to know more about the evidence base for that. But what's the challenge here? I mean, is there a bias in schools or colleges, maybe, that sixth form colleges that take on students, if you haven't done a triple science, the triple science pathway, you won't be allowed on? Or is it just around the teaching quality?
So I think if you looked at other subjects and you said that you have two clear routes for doing that subject, you're going to create inequity. So if you, for instance, within English, if everyone followed different curriculums, you will create inequity within that. And I suppose when you bring that back into science, by having the double and triple, so when people do start A-levels or go on to an apprenticeship, if they have different knowledge from their to their colleagues, you are creating a problem. And I think that when we talked about the 8% of schools that are that aren't offering triple science, we're not blaming them. I don't think there's nothing, they might have made a decision, but if you're going to have a system that says you offer both double and triple, every school needs to do that, and that is the government policy. So I think you either need to do that, or you need to come to a different way of delivery where everyone gets the same product. Because I would say that, you talk about teaching quality, there was some evidence in the report that actually teachers that really enjoy teaching triple science will only go to a school that's doing triple science. And you're often getting non-specialists teaching some of those elements in certain schools, and that's causing inequity as well. So I think there are multiple barriers there, but I think having one system across the board, or doing the current policy and actually making sure all schools are offering it would increase equity.
Great, thank you. Right, I'm going to turn to the questions, and we've got 23 to get through in 20 minutes. So
1 minute each.
1 minute each. Okay. So Roma Agrawal, hi Roma, nice to see you watching. Mentions that there's a version of the cartoon that has the solid fence is replaced with a chain linked fence so that people can see through it, and that's kind of the removal of systemic issues. That's really interesting. I haven't seen that. Do send it to me, Roma. But she wants to get your thoughts on in the post kind of pandemic COVID world, whether we can use technology to address some of these issues. Would it be possible to remove the need to have these kind of specialist teachers to teach, every student, and actually draw on the, great ed tech that we have these days?
That's a really interesting question, and thanks for that, Roma. I think we did a roundtable when we launched this report, bringing together STEM and leaders and policymakers. And one thing that came across in this last 3 months we've really learned is that actually you can do really good teacher CPD online, but teaching students, there are more difficulties around that. But I think there definitely could be potential to bring in experts at different times. And I think, when you look at schemes like STEM ambassadors, or you're looking at role models, bringing them in on an online basis might be a better way to reach more young people. So I think definitely.
Okay, interesting. A really good question from Gina Rippon here, which is to do with primary schools. Now, you did mention in your presentation and in the report, Louise Archer's work is cited very frequently around perceptions, identities forming early on in science. But one issue that's often overlooked, Gina asks, is around the low level of science expertise and confidence at the primary school level. Can you kind of give a sense of how this might be addressed through the recommendations of the report?
So that is definitely in the report, and we talk about primary science and the lack of specialists. I think it's around training, and the other aspect is around recruitment and retention. So if government see this as a real problem, then they can obviously put incentives to attract different teachers. And I suppose to go back to your point about special pleading, I'm not too sure we are special pleading for STEM, but what we do want to make sure is that by the time young people get to secondary school, that their options or their interest in science hasn't totally dissipated. So I think the earlier, and the report brings this up, and I think Louise Archer's work exemplifies this brilliantly. We need to start younger, and I think the report, when I talk about 600 different organisations offering STEM enrichment activities, a lot of those are for secondary school, a lot of those for GCSE and A-level, where you're just cherry picking the people that are already on that route into science, and we need to invest far more within primary schools and provide more support. So I think that is something that I think we would like government to look at as well. But also I think our role as the STEM organisations, we need to look at ourselves as well.
Okay. Faisal Khan asks, you mentioned the report stated schools' role in GCSE option selection is leading to inequity, especially in the most disadvantaged areas. But the report does not seem to mention other routes. And I was going to pick up on this in my questions as well, Faisal, thank you, around vocational pathways. Now, it does address issues around parity of esteem with vocational technical pathways, and it says that young black boys, I think, if I remember correctly, are often encouraged into those kind of technical pathways as opposed to academic. But more generally, there are good pathways into particularly engineering through STEM. And how do we address the kind of this parity of esteem issue, and not say it's one is better or worse than the other, but actually try and open these up to all people?
I think it's a really good point. And I think when we started the inquiry, when we talked about careers, it was a limited issue, but it became more and more apparent that young people weren't being offered a wide range of options. So knowing what an apprenticeship would lead to, and that actually in some of the reports that we reviewed, they talked about, the provision in schools was generally really quite poor. And so you've got to link that if you've got these other options for young people to go in, you need people that are going to talk about them. And I think your other potential issue is that a lot of the teachers that are teaching these subjects have gone through a traditional route. So how do we bring in those different role models to explain the routes and how they've benefited those people? So I think it sort of links quite a lot of the recommendations together, but there are a number of different routes that we need to look at around that.
Yeah, right. Okay, that's interesting. One of the kind of key themes I'm coming across both in the chat and in the questions is around measures, accountability measures, and so on. And I think this can apply to various things in the report. We talked about careers. Now, the older adage, what gets measured gets managed, is obviously very relevant here. Now, of course, the government's focus on core subjects, English and mathematics, at primary school level, science was taken out as a core subject, and there are arguments for and against that in the primary system. In secondary, again, very much the strength of focus. And of course, Ofsted has a role here as well. So, I mean, do you think that, school inspectors need to spend more time and more emphasis on how schools are approaching STEM? And do you think the performance indicators from government being so focused on maths and English are detrimental to the sciences? And I might add in there as well, so of course the sciences are core subject as well. You have computer science within there, but of course design and technology, which is very much the kind of practical manifestation of both STEM and arts subjects, the kind of fusion of them, being not even an EBAC subject. How does this kind of play out?
So I think you're totally right. What you measure, it makes it what's most important. And I think when we looked through the data, so that I think when we talk about measuring the characteristics of people taking double and triple science, that you don't have those measures, you can't spot those anomalies. And I think arguably the focus on the report and what comes through, focusing on English and maths does sometimes cause a problem, but I think maths is so linked in to science that at least it's there. So I think we need to measure more, not just at a school level, but at a holistic level. So you have this data and you can see these pockets and where you can actually put interventions. To talk about Ofsted, I think that I've seen talks by Amanda Spielman, the Chief Inspector, and she's very positive. I think she's spoken to ASE and others about the role of science. So I think there are lots of different organisations, whether it's Ofqual, whether it's Ofsted, that can be a part of this, but they take their lead from government policy in many ways. So I think we need to target Department for Education, and that's sort of my answer to that.
Okay. As a Knight asks about the makeup of the APPG group, I mean, she says the select committee, but I assume, Alison, you mean the APPG. The slides you showed of everyone meeting in person with Norman Lamb showed a room made up entirely of a white audience. The moderators today, that's me, and you speaking are also white and male. We're not doing great work here. And I acknowledge, Alison, that actually a lot of our speakers throughout this series have been white. We've done very well on gender diversity, but we are working on the issue of ethnic diversity on this series as well. So please be aware that it has been acknowledged. Can you start with addressing the systemic issues that are present in your own organisation as part of addressing the wider picture? I suppose this goes to the British Science Association, as well as the Academy. The slides you presented showed a disproportionate number of people of colour, although these were not presumably on the APPG. So your thoughts are welcome on that.
I think it's a great challenge, and I'd say that today my role is as an ally to communities that are underrepresented within STEM. As an organisation, the British Science Association is currently undertaking a 3-year review into the way that we engage in equality, diversity, and inclusion. And I would say the makeup of the APPG represents probably, in terms of the members, the groups that are within Parliament. So it's a mirror to Parliament. And she is obviously, Chiomwara MP is obviously a really key voice in this because she's experienced working within engineering. But there are other voices, and I think it's important that we take people on as allies. I think you are right that the picture that I put of Norman Lamb MP does show a lack of diversity in the room. Those are all-party parliamentary group meetings are open to anyone. The people that came were those people, and we had other events which were probably had more diversity. But I think it's a real challenge, but I think what I take up from working with Chi and other members is that we all need to be allies and actually overcome some of these challenges. So I think it's a great point.
Mm-hmm. And Alison, the Academy is also working very hard to address issues of diversity within its fellowship and all our programs. It's a very key part of our Academy's strategy for 2020 to 2025. And I can show you the trustee board met last night and discussing this very issue, and we will be coming forward with what we're doing on this very soon. Okay, one quick question on the chat. Do you have a template for letters to MPs?
We do. If you go to that website, BritishScienceAssociation.org/APPG, the report, you've got the report, and then underneath it, there's a write to your MP, and there's a template letter there. So if anyone would like to do that, we would really appreciate that.
Great, thank you. Alison says that she teaches in the further education sector, which is facing new challenges with T-levels being introduced from 2021. That aside, she's concerned about the present equity of progression of students from vocational subjects, vocational sciences, such as BTECs, to higher education. And she'd be keen to know whether the review looked at that and what could be done to support FE to HE conversion.
So we did look at FE and around different options. I think there are some areas, and I think in this I would talk about our silences. In the report, we sort of reviewed lots of literature, and there is some real silences, especially on routes that have changed recently. There isn't huge amounts of evidence around some of these areas. So I think around apprenticeships and so on, there are bits, and obviously there have been changes to those. There's bits of evidence, but we're still lacking some really good evidence on how you transition people forward. So I think there are some things within the report where there are silences that we as a sector need to do more on. So that would be my response, but I'm happy to talk more offline about that.
Mm-hmm. You said right from the outset, that there needs to be a joined up approach by government on this. And Jessica Hamer points out that, we also need to encourage conversations between schools and parents being very important influences in young people's interests and decision making. I mean, this is a societal challenge, isn't it? And I'm just wondering, how do we go about, engaging parents? Of course, our organisations can do this, but if we're really serious about a kind of joined-up government approach, I've often been talking recently about strategic workforce planning. The government being much more interventionist in how it makes young people decide what subjects to do, whether that's through free higher education or free FE college provision, post A-level, post vocational qualifications. What do you think needs to happen in terms of this joined up government approach, and which departments, and how do we engage parents?
So I think the engaging parents point is really interesting, but I'd go on that how is it all linked up within government. I'd say that from our review, and actually a review of I think the National Audit Office did, shows that you have different pockets, whether it's in the Department for Transport, the Department for Business, Industrial Strategy and Energy, or other departments. They all have pockets of interest where you have where the STEM inspiration budget, which is then different to, what the budget is for schools. And making sure that there is one department that sort of sees across that is really important, because otherwise you are having these lots of little pockets of things that maybe the resources aren't being utilised as well as they can, and it's very confusing then for parents and teachers. I think I might have skipped over a slide, and I just ask if we could go back to slide 3, where I talk about the British Science Association, the way that we sort of see the world and where people's interest is, and where we think that there are about 25% of the British population that have no interest in science, and then about 50% who are inactive. All these people are obviously parents, and so we need to do an awful lot of work and create science engagement activities and so on. Sorry, I might have got my numbers wrong. Yeah, I think it's 3. It's page 3 of it that sort of goes through, and we need more interventions to tackle this with parents. But we at the British Science Association do a lot of public engagement, especially with disadvantaged or underserved groups, and the more that we can do that, the better, because when a little girl goes back home, the biggest influencer are their parents. So the more that we can do it, and I think the British Science Association is doing it, and this is the sort of our zone map, and obviously when you go down the line to the not interested and inactive, the more likely you are to have females, people from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds, and to come from lower social groups, or lower social economic groups, I should say. So I think there is a real job that I don't just see for the Department for Education, but it's a societal role. And hopefully COVID-19 has shown people that science is a really important part of life. And the more that we can get people to sort of engage and have these discussions with their children, the better.
Mm-hmm. Great. We're coming to the end, unfortunately. There's so many questions I haven't answered, but I did want to turn to a question around careers. There was no mention of the Gatsby benchmarks in your presentation. Was this considered when researching the report?
Yes, it is.
Generally, going back to this whole issue of careers. I mean, it's always been rubbish, hasn't it? Let's face it. But this does seem to be a major issue for us in the UK.
It does, and on the recommendation, there's a footnote that said the monitoring process could make it a statutory requirement to adopt the Baker Clause and the Gatsby benchmarks by all schools by 2020. We definitely talk about the Gatsby benchmarks, and I think you're right that careers advice has often not been particularly good in English schools, and I think the STEM subjects suffer from that because so many careers are coming down the line or changing so quickly that unless young people know about, whether it's artificial intelligence or all these things that they could be involved in that are a mix of, the sciences and the arts, that they're going to be choosing subjects which is going to make them very hard to go back and sort of re-qualify for those.
Great, thank you. There are so many questions still to answer. I'm so sorry. This has been a really stimulating Q&A. Jon, thank you once again for an excellent talk and a really great Q&A. And thank you everyone for watching. It's a really important session for us to end on. There's a huge amount of work to be done here on addressing diversity and inclusion within STEM education and in our workforces more generally. And we will be doing much more on that. And you may have heard that the Academy is now working with Lewis Hamilton on a commission for addressing ethnic diversity in motorsport. And we will be telling you more about that in the next series. So, okay, that's it from us for this term. We'll be starting up again in September with a whole new group of super interesting talks. From super exciting speakers. We'll be covering the introduction of T-levels, which I mentioned earlier, applications and progression in higher education, STEM subjects, particularly engineering, practical learning in schools, graduate recruitment challenges, and much, much more. Until then, have a wonderful summer. Keep that high factor suntan lotion on. You know what English weather is like. and goodbye. Thank you very much.